Hi, um, Marianne Capiello here from the Classroom Bookshelf, and I'm so happy to be joined by Kate Messner, author of Dr. Fauci, How a Boy, I'm going to mess up the title, Kate.
You got it.
Okay. Um, how a boy from Brooklyn became America's doctor. And so
Yeah.
thank you so much for being with us, Kate.
Oh, thank you for having me, Marianne. Happy to chat with you today.
So, for our listeners, I'm going to start off with some questions for Kate about the big picture in thinking about this book and contextualizing this book in this particular moment in time. And then I'm going to transition to asking Kate some questions about her research process. And then from there, we'll have a conversation about the writing and revising process. So, Kate, to start us off, in the back matter, you have in your reference list that you did an email interview with Dr. Fauci last May, but it was in November of 2020 that you had the substantive interview that fed into your research for writing this book. So since November, you had to process and make sense of your research. You had to write your book, revise your book, working with your editor, and get the manuscript to a point where you then could turn it over to Alexandra Bai, the illustrator. So when picture books often take at least 2 years, how did this book happen so quickly? What can you tell us about that process?
Yeah, this book was a bit of a whirlwind. So what happened is I reached out to Dr. Fauci's office last May, actually while I was working on a totally different book. I have a book called The Next President that came out in 2020 about what presidents were doing before they became president. And I'm actually doing a follow-up to that book with Chronicle called The Next Great Scientist, all about the childhoods of people who went on to be great scientists and make contributions in science and health. And I had sent Dr. Fauci's office an email asking about his childhood because he was going to be one of the 50 or 60 scientists we included in that book. And when I heard back this story about Dr. Fauci riding his bicycle all around the streets of Brooklyn, delivering prescriptions for his dad's pharmacy, really kind of caught my attention. And I started reading more about his background. Like everybody, I've been watching Dr. Fauci on the news for almost every night for over a year. And was fascinated to read about his upbringing and realize that his story would really resonate with kids who have also seen him on the news and were curious. So I spent much of the summer and fall doing a lot of reading about, all the interviews he's had and different speeches he's given, and also, his background in government. I know many Americans have just heard about Dr. Fauci in the past year or so, but he's actually been serving presidents since the Reagan administration. So he has a 40 plus year career in public health. So I did all that reading, and then this fall approached Dr. Fauci through his office again to ask if a Zoom interview might be possible, because no matter how much reading you do about different interviews and things, and the public record is great when it comes to a person's career and their public life, but it doesn't have those stories from childhood, and that's what I was really looking for this book. So I was delighted that they were game to schedule an interview, and then the whole thing came together very, very quickly. Normally I would spend much more time. I mean, I did spend from spring to that November interview doing research and kind of starting to play with
Mm.
some drafts. But the final draft did come together pretty quickly. And then once Simon and Schuster and my editor Kendra Levin acquired the manuscript, then things really kicked into high gear. I think I had an editorial letter within 2 days after she made an offer on the book. And so, we went back and forth. It was, I think both of us just kind of, um, ate, slept, this manuscript for a couple of weeks to do all the revisions that would normally happen over the course of many months in about 2 weeks. We just kept going back and forth, and it was every day. So we did get it into shape very quickly. And then Alexandra Bai, the illustrator, did some just incredibly quick and efficient work on her beautiful illustrations. I still can't get over. She did just a spectacular job with this book and did it in such a short period of time. We really wanted the book to be available this summer because it's a time when we know children are starting to be vaccinated, young people. We have vaccines for ages 12 plus now, and probably by around the end of this year, early next year, I'm hearing we'll have even younger kids being vaccinated. And We wanted to share the story with them because the back matter in this book also includes a lot of information about vaccines, which is super important. I'm sure you know there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we want to get accurate information to families.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I really appreciate that context of the child reader outside of a school setting, outside of a formal learning setting, but anyone having trepidation or concerns or questions about the vaccine, this is another pathway for getting information in the hands of kids and families. So I appreciate that. Given, as you've said, the relevancy of this book in this particular moment in time, in after 15 really hard months during which Dr. Fauci has been America's doctor, and in some ways the world's doctor, given his reach and given the respect with which he is held around the world. What was different for you about research and writing this biography as compared to some of the other nonfiction books that you've written in the past?
Well, much of the nonfiction that I write, whether it's a biography about people or about events in history, it's the more distant past. And so you're dealing with things that have more of an official public record laid down, but also people that all you have to work with are the documents they left behind, the diaries, the letters, things like that. And in this case, it was great because I was actually able to speak with the subject, with Dr. Fauci. So that was really different and great. The other thing that was interesting, and this was the case with this book as well as another book I've been working on related to the pandemic, where I have a series called History Smashers with Random House, that's all about smashing myths about history. And book 6 in that series, coming out in the fall, will be History Smashers, Plagues, and Pandemics. So really for both of these titles, I was sort of writing history in progress, which is a fascinating thing to be doing. The timing worked out very well because by January and February of 2021, when I was wrapping up work on the draft, we did have a better sense for where the pandemic might be going and how it might eventually end. We had our first vaccines released. Dr. Fauci had been vaccinated. President Biden had been vaccinated. My mom and dad had been vaccinated. So there was even then this sense of hope and that we were perhaps beginning to turn a corner. So that's where the story ends. It doesn't, chronicle the entire COVID-19 pandemic globally, but does talk about the development of vaccines and how all of that that work and the collaboration among scientists is what led to that feeling of hope that we might be rounding the bend here.
Was book 6 in your history Mythbusters series always going to be plagues, or was that a topic that sort of rose out of this moment in time?
It was an idea. So I had, when you start a series like this, you have, probably dozens of ideas. I've got a notebook full of ideas for possible topics for the History Smashers books. And when we finished work on book 5, we were wrapping up and it was time to say, okay, what do we want to do? I had scribbled down months and months earlier, before anyone had ever heard of COVID-19, plagues, plagues in history. And by March, which is when we were talking about what to do for book 6, that one really kind of rose to the top and said, well, this is pretty timely right now. So it's not a book that deals just with modern pandemics. It goes all the way back to the plague of Athens and, the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and then all the way up through the emerging diseases that we've seen, in the past 40 or 50 years, HIV, AIDS, and Ebola, and SARS, and including COVID-19.
Wonderful. So in transitioning into a deeper conversation now about your research process, are you comfortable sharing with us some of the questions that you asked Dr. Fauci directly during your interview? Where did you start with your questions with him? Did your questions change? Did the ever-changing COVID context shape your questions as you interviewed him and spoke with him in follow-up?
Yeah, so with any picture book biography about a living subject, when I'm doing an interview, I'm trying very carefully to be, I'm very careful to be mindful of the person's time. And particularly in this situation, because I was very, you know, I realized that I'd been, was asking for time from what might have been the busiest man in America at that time. And was just incredibly grateful. I ended up Zooming with Dr. Fauci, doing a Zoom audio call with him when he was literally on his way home from work one night. So, that was about 45 minutes for our first interview. And so I wanted to make sure I used that time to ask questions that weren't already answered somewhere else. And he's done a lot of interviews. There have been a lot of profile pieces written about him. And again, he has more than a 40-year record in public health. That's, all part of the public record. So I consumed all of that information and boiled it all down, and then chose the handful of things that I really wanted to know more about that wasn't already out there. And much of that, as I said, related to Dr. Fauci's childhood, right? We have a public record of what he's done at the the Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, but not a public record so much of what his dad said to him when he was 10 years old. And those are the stories that I really wanted to tell, because that helps kids have a way into the story, right? If they can see this person who's standing at the podium next to the president as somebody like them, right? Somebody who grew up curious and somebody who liked to play baseball and play sports and hang out with his friends. And I think it makes the idea of being a scientist and making those contributions to public health more accessible. So those were most of the questions that I focused on with Dr. Fauci when we spoke is, what'd you like to do when you were a kid? Can you tell me more about delivering prescriptions for your dad's pharmacy? Was there any advice anybody gave you when you were growing up? And he told a lot of stories about, how his dad would help him and his sister with their homework. And if they got really stuck on something, he would just never let them give up. He would just sit there and say, this problem has a solution. There is a solution to this problem. Don't get frustrated. Don't give up. Just keep looking at it differently and you're going to get it. And, some of those stories, as he's telling those stories, some of them really surfaced as having a real influence on his life and his work at, in public health. And so those were the stories that I followed up on a lot. It was also interesting to me. He talked about, how he grew up in this, kind of rough and tumble neighborhood in Brooklyn. And some of the guys he hung out with were a little rough around the edges, but he also went to a pretty rigorous prep school. And so kind of lived in two different worlds. He'd take the train and the bus into the city, into Manhattan for this to go to school at Regis High School. And he'd be talking philosophy and, classic literature with his fellow scholars there. And then he'd come home to his Brooklyn neighborhood and play stickball with these guys who, got in fights sometimes and got in trouble sometimes. And he learned to get, to just slip between those two worlds because he was able to talk to everybody. He had a real reputation for being able to explain things in a way you could understand, whether it was, something with medicine or philosophy or batting averages. He had that sort of reputation. And that's something else that I think surfaced in his public life later on, that skill of being able to communicate and do that with a lot of clarity. So those were the stories I was asking about and asking for more detail about. And the other thing that's interesting when I'm interviewing somebody for a picture book biography, I'm also thinking in the back of my mind as I'm listening to the information, how does this look on the page? Because a picture book biography is very visual. Our illustrator tells half the story. And so what is this story going to look like on the page? And there were certain stories that Dr. Fauci told that I could just imagine with Alexandra's illustrations, the story of his parents, his parents working with him at the pharmacy, and his grandfather, who was an Italian immigrant, cooking for the family every Sunday. He'd be, over these pots of bubbling red sauce on the stove. And so those images come out too. And those were the scenes that I really tried to get more information about to make sure we would depict those in the story in a way that was representative of what really happened, not just the accurate details, but the feeling of what happened as well. And that's one of Alexandra's real gifts, I think, is that she captured the emotion of those stories.
The yellow and oranges, the warm colors that she used in the illustrations of Dr. Fauci's childhood and early years really are so powerful in creating that sense of warmth and enveloping you as the reader in his world. I think
Yeah, I
that's,
thought so too. And then fascinating to me when I first saw her sketches is how the colors shifted when we got into the more modern discussions of particularly COVID-19 and how it sort of, emptied out the streets of New York. There's a whole shift in the color palette that I thought was just it changes the mood of the story. It's why, picture books are I think so magical because they are, two people's creation. Well, more than two people, really, if we consider the editorial team at Simon and Schuster and the production team. But there's so much that Alexandra added to the story with her illustration that I couldn't have done as the author.
yeah, it's a really powerful shift in the book. And I think that, for young readers, that sense of when picture book biographies show them people who become famous or become noted for something as kids, just the same as they are, there's something so powerful about who you are right now matters. Like who you are and your life matters. It all helps shape you into the person that you are going to choose to become. And I think that that's really particularly beautiful for students to see with a public figure like Dr. Fauci at this particular moment in time, and to make those connections. So when balancing the book and thinking about how do I ground my reader in the context of Dr. Fauci's childhood and early years, and then framing his later years and his professional life, and how do you condense or manage an over 40-year career in public service? What were some of the challenges that you had in framing the book and balancing out childhood versus adult life?
Yeah, I mean, challenge with any informational picture book is you only have 32 pages, maybe 40 or 48 if you're really lucky. And this book is a little bit longer than the standard picture book, but you have all this information and you really have to whittle it down to just this handful of really key themes and ideas that are going to resonate with young people. So for me, as you mentioned, that the book does kind of have this progression from Dr. Fauci's childhood, where we spent a lot of time and a lot of pages, because that to me is really the open door for young readers in this book, is for them to see this guy that you see on the news who's very important and serious used to be a kid just like you. He used to be a curious kid. And to me, that makes science and public health, those fields, feel really accessible for kids. And that was one real goal of this book for me, was an invitation to young readers who are future scientists. And then we make a transition. So we spend just a couple pages getting Dr. Fauci through, or Anthony Fauci through high school and college and medical school. And then he is Dr. Fauci and he's working at the National Institutes of Health. And then we kind of broad brush some of the challenges that he was going to face, because he, as we mentioned, advised 7 different presidents now on infectious diseases, and going back to all the way back to the days of HIV and AIDS, and through Ebola and the SARS outbreak. And then that brings us to the second bigger section of the book, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And we wanted to slow down and spend some more time there, because kids don't often get to read about history that they've experienced personally. And, the kids were so directly affected by this pandemic that we wanted them to see what was happening behind the scenes. Why do you have this vaccine opportunity now? What was the work going on behind the scenes? And also, we wanted them to see scientists struggling to figure this out. Science isn't easy or fast, especially when we're dealing with something like a brand new virus. You're gonna do the best you can with the evidence you have, but you're going to get more evidence and you're going to have to revise your ideas. And that was something that happened really throughout this pandemic. And it's interesting, people who don't understand that are quick to criticize and say, well, they got this wrong and they got that wrong. Well, it was a brand new virus, right? And what scientists need to do is say, oh, so now we know that it's like this. And that means we have to change our approach and do these things instead. So that idea of science as a self-correcting field where you learn more and you adjust and you collaborate and share ideas is one we really wanted to make sure got across in the story for kids too. So that's why we spent quite a lot of time with the COVID-19 pandemic. There's one illustration in the book that I absolutely love. when it talks about how this virus just stopped the whole world in its tracks, and cities shut down, and people had to work and go to school from home. There's an illustration of this family all in one room trying to do their work, and the kids are on their laptops trying to take their classes, and the mom is on the phone, and the dog's under the table, and the TV is on. And I showed it to a friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, every kid who reads this is going to point
Yes.
to one of those kids on the laptop taking classes and say, 'That's me. That was me.'"
Yes.
So we wanted to really explore that idea too, that this was something that affected everybody, including our young readers.
I think it's really powerful the ways in which you model through the book the scientific process. And you do that so beautifully with the anecdotes about Dr. Fauci's life. And you kind of create this through line of asking questions about gathering evidence and evaluating that evidence, even if that evidence is about, playing basketball and how you can score more points by relying on your speed rather than on your height or your jump. So I think that you layer that process so beautifully. And then there's one moment that's part of that transition as Dr. Fauci has started to work for the National Institute of Health. And there's an illustration of him, and they look like file folder boxes lined up on the shelf, and he's reaching and grabbing one. And there, each of them is labeled with a specific disease that he has worked on and a key year in that research process. And you distill so beautifully on that page. You write, every new disease was a mystery to wonder about, a problem to solve. Where had it come from? How did it spread? How could it be prevented until researchers found a cure or vaccine? And it's really like you distill the whole field of epidemiology with those few questions that you pose for young readers. And as I read and reread the book, I wondered, from a writing process, did you arrive at that paragraph pretty easily? Or did you face challenges? Because I look at, in my own life, living through all of those diseases emerging for the first time, did you wrestle with trying to say more about each of those different processes before we have this glorious two-page spread that works so beautifully?
Yeah, my first drafts are inevitably way too long because I'm fascinated by all of this. If left to my own devices, I would have gone off for 5 pages about Ebola and the emergence of these new diseases and what that means. And you can't do that in a picture book. Let's face it. So in my first draft, that's the draft where I just get everything down. And in one of my early drafts, I had done a sentence or two about each of those diseases. And this year, this happened. And in this year, this happened. And in this year, this happened. And it was just too much. And it also took away from that real focus of the story, which, as you point out, is the idea that science is about questions first. Before it's about answers of any kind at all, it starts with the questions. And so putting I think this is something that I had talked through with Kendra Levin, my editor, the idea of putting these folders, these binders up on the shelf labeled with the disease and a year. And that's an invitation to young readers who are curious and want to know more, right? They can use that as a jumping off point, and they can research Ebola, they can research SARS, but it's not done in a way that pulls them out of the primary themes of the book. And that's always the goal. So I would love to tell you that, oh, that came easily and it was no problem, but no, that was the work of many revisions. So thanks.
Absolutely. And the book is so rich in back matter. You give your readers so much in the back matter. And I imagine that calibration of what's in the primary narrative and what do you wait and offer to readers to choose to read or not in the back matter was a big part of the process. Can you talk to us a little bit about the decisions that you and your editor made about what you included in the back matter?
Yeah, I mean, I am a huge fan of back matter because it allows you to offer more to those readers who are extra curious and just in love with the topic. And the best words that an author can ever hear from an editor are, "You can have as much back matter as you want." And so I was, the day I got a note from Kendra about that said, "Oh no, we can put that in the back matter, and you can have this in the back matter, and it's okay." And I was like, "Ah, yes, we can include all
Yes.
this stuff." So yeah, we did aim from the very beginning to have very rich back matter for this book because there's a lot to talk about, and there are a
Yes.
lot of issues raised in the story. When I write a picture book, I really want to keep to the big themes and big ideas and poetic language in the primary text. And as far as exact dates that somebody graduated from this college or that college, those details can be somewhere else. They don't necessarily
Mhm.
even need to be in that main text. So that was why we had a timeline in the book. It was really important to me to include some of the science of vaccines and how vaccines work. That's not something that a lot of young people have been introduced to, before fourth or fifth grade. And it's very relevant, and they want to know, especially at a time when there's so much misinformation going around about vaccines. It's good to have solid information out there and to talk with kids about, what exactly is this vaccine? Why is getting this shot going to keep me from getting that disease? So it was a great challenge to explain that in language that was very kid friendly, but still very scientifically accurate. And we had folks at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases looking over that language and saying, yeah, this is good and this works, and helping us with that. So we really wanted to include information about vaccines in very kid-friendly terms and explain how getting a vaccine doesn't just protect you, it protects the people around you too. And so there's a lot of a sense of community in what's happening in our country right now as far as the vaccination efforts. And it's been really great to see. My county in particular in northern New York has done really, really well in getting vaccines out to folks. And our COVID numbers, as we talk today, have dropped to almost nothing. So it's really great to see that, and just great to see people, doing this to help their communities and to get kids back to school and help one another.
I think the richness of your back matter does so much. There's so much for educators to work with and for your young readers to work with. You give us more of a grounding in the chronology of Dr. Fauci's life. So readers who are interested in that have that. And all the additional scientific information is so important and so clarifying. And then from an informational literacy standpoint, you not only show your references so that if there are teachers who want to harness some of those articles and interviews that are available to allow their students to explore, to think about, well, okay, Kate Messner did this with this information. How would you write about it? I think there's lots of rich opportunities with what you've shared. And then you also have the further reading section. So you're giving young people a pathway out into other books on the vaccination process, on other diseases. And so we would just really appreciate all that you put into that back matter, because I think there's a versatility with how teachers can use the book, because you've given them so much right there within the pages.
Oh, thank you. It's one of the reasons, as a former teacher, I have always loved back matter so much. It's like you get two books in one.
You mean, yes.
So yeah, so I hope that'll be
Yeah,
really helpful. We also have an educator's guide, a teaching and discussion guide for the book that was created by Melissa Garrett, an
wonderful.
amazing educator and writer who lives in Maine.
In Maine,
So
yeah.
that's available on the my website and the Simon and Schuster website as well. I hope that'll be helpful to teachers too.
And we'll make sure that that's linked on our classroom bookshelf entry as well. So is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would want educators, school librarians, or your young readers to know about the process of creating this book?
Just that I hope it comes to readers who love science, and I hope it helps them see that these jobs that look so far away and important are really accessible. Those jobs are filled by people who love science the way they do, people who are curious, who ask lots of questions, and people who want to help make things better. So I hope that's the biggest thing I really hope readers will take away from this when they read it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for your time today with this interview. Thank you for this beautiful book and this important and timely book. I really appreciate all that you offer for young people.
Thank you so
So
much. It was great chatting with you.
take care, and I'm going to stop recording.